Good evening. My name is Patty Gallagher, and on behalf of the Academic Senate, I want to welcome you all, those of us in the room and those from afar, to the 55th Faculty Research Lecture. This lecture is a tradition that dates back to 1967 and is the longest campus tradition. This Senate institution, held on every campus, honors a distinguished faculty member's record in research. The nomination of Jennifer González, Professor of History of Art and Visual Culture, was approved by enthusiastic acclamation at the May 2020 Senate meeting. I would like to thank the 2019-20 Committee on Faculty Research Lecture, Kathy Foley, Lisa Couture, Barbara Rogoff, Ronaldo Wilson, and Seth Rogen. Oh, I knew I was going to do that. Thank you, Seth Rogen, for your work. Seth Rubin for nominating Professor González, and to thank this year's CFRL for their support of this event. So here we are, 3 years later. Pandemics and atmospheric rivers can deter us, but they cannot stop us from honoring and celebrating the work of our admired colleague, Jennifer González. Thank you to Chancellor Larive and to Professor González herself for their donation to the Dolores Huerta Research Center for the Americas in honor of this lecture. Finally, it's my great pleasure to invite our campus provost and Executive Vice Chancellor Lori Kletzer to the podium.
Thank you, Patty. Thank you all for being here today, and those of us here in person and those joining us on the live stream. And I want to take this opportunity, because it's my opportunity too, to welcome you all back into the very beautiful music recital hall. For many, many, many of us, it has been too long. And it's really delightful to be here tonight to celebrate Jennifer González. The Faculty Research Lecture, as Patty said, is just a spectacular honor to be honored by your peers through the work of the Committee on the Faculty Research Lecture is an acclamation and an accomplishment that probably has no peer. And this really is an evening for celebrating our very dear colleague, Jennifer González. Jennifer, your contributions to UCSC are many, they're deep, and they're impactful. Jennifer is a scholar of impact and a teacher and a mentor who has touched the lives of very many. And as I hand this podium off, I also want to say, Jennifer, you are a very dear neighbor and a cherished one. So now I'd like to get out of the way and hand this podium off to Dean Celine Pareñas Samizu. So thank you for being here tonight.
Welcome to the Music Recital Hall and the UC Santa Cruz Arts Division to celebrate Professor Jennifer González. Her exceptional work embodies the core mission of the arts in the face of deep exclusions for which creative industries and academic disciplines are notoriously known. Our mission centers on providing the best training for artists and arts scholars. Here you will feel the unstoppable force of our vision, unifying us all. And among us, Jennifer González lifts up not only our students, she is known for boosting our colleagues. I just came back from London, which is why I'm wearing this fascinator. And it was for the opening of Sir Isaac Julian's first retrospective in the UK. And there he took the opportunity to mention how Jennifer González was a champion of his from the very beginning and was very instrumental in bringing him to this campus. So Jennifer is a scholar and mentor of the highest caliber. She opens doors not only for our students, but also our colleagues. And I love Jennifer's book, Subject to Display, Reframing Race in Contemporary Installation Arts, and it's offering the first in-depth analysis of contemporary artists who use installation art, like Isaac Julian, to stage critical assessments of the politics of race. With great galvanizing lucidity, she wrote that race is a social discourse with a visual history. And as a staunch advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion, Jennifer's astute observations really resonate with me as we in the arts create new cultures of collaboration in and beyond the arts. Our work in the Arts Division tackles the most vexing issues of our time as we work together to make sure students not only feel included and heard, but make art and think as scholars with the assumption of their freedom and their power. Students must feel a future with an infinitude of opportunities to thrive and achieve because of their work with our world-class faculty, of which Jennifer is a very significant part, in her help leading the way of decolonizing the curriculum with her outstanding research, pedagogy, and advising of our students. So that decolonization doesn't just happen in the classroom, but it happens in the very relationships she creates with them. So tonight, as she is bestowed the great honor of 55th Faculty Research Lecturer, I am so eager for us to be in this room together, to listen and to learn from her about the geopolitics of migration with an emphasis on the role of art as a form of political democracy. It's much needed work. It is now my pleasure to invite my dear colleague, Professor Shelley Stamp from Film and Digital Media, to introduce the important work of Professor González.
Thank you, Dean Celine. Good evening, everyone. What an honor and what a joy it is to introduce Professor Jennifer González. I want to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is unceded territory of the Awaswas-speaking Yupi tribe. The Amamutsan tribal band, comprised of descendants of indigenous people taken to missions Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. The Faculty Research Lecturer at UC Santa Cruz is one of our campus's highest honors. Professor González is a leading thinker in the fields of art history and visual culture, a scholar whose work consistently pushes those disciplines to consider race, indigeneity, and the legacies of colonialism. Race, González reminds us, is a social discourse that has a visual history. She traces that visual history across multiple forms, including installation art, performance art, digital media, museum display, and public space, always considering how visual representations mediate identity, race, and gender. Her scholarship consistently centers the work of indigenous makers, artists of color, and queer artists, and consistently centers questions of social justice. In the introduction to a collection she co-edited on visual activism, González and her co-authors wrote about the imperative to provide counter-discourses of perception, all the while acknowledging that learning to unsee or re-see is not a task easily undertaken. This philosophy of learning to unsee and re-see is one that guides much of her work. Professor González's first book, Subject to Display, Reframing Race in Contemporary Installation Art, considers the work of installation artists who contest and restage conventional museum displays of bodies, images, and cultural artifacts, highlighting how constructions of race and racial hierarchies are grounded in visual technologies of display. It's a brilliant piece of work. Dean Celine testified to that as well, and we are not alone in this thinking. Subject to Display was a finalist for the Charles Rufus Maury Award given by the College Art Association, her discipline's preeminent scholarly organization. Professor González's 2013 book on installation artist Pepón Osorio received 2 commendations from the International Latino Book Awards: Best Art Book, 2nd place, and Best Latino Focused Book, honorable mention. Professor Gonzalez's recent co-edited collection, Chicano and Chicana Art, a critical anthology, traces the development of Chicanics art from its early role in the Chicano civil rights movement of the 1960s through to the present. It includes the voices of artists, curators, scholars, cultural critics, addressing topics such as the politics of the border, public art practices, queer and feminist figurations of Chicanics bodies. This groundbreaking volume was named one of the best art books of the decade by Art News magazine. Professor González is a profound intellect in the field of contemporary art. That's clear. What's also notable, I think, about her work is her commitment to public engagement and public-facing projects. So in addition to publishing her scholarship, like so many of us do, Professor González also writes exhibition catalog essays for art galleries and museums. She publishes interviews with contemporary artists. She reviews gallery exhibits for leading art magazines. She records oral history interviews with living artists for the Smithsonian. All of these endeavors are acts of enormous generosity, where she shares her extraordinary expertise and knowledge with those outside the academy. That's important for all of us to do in some form or another, but it's especially important for scholars who work on contemporary art and media, who center artists from underrepresented and marginalized communities, and who foreground matters of race and social justice. Professor González has a deep and sustained commitment to our campus, as many of you know. She has taught in the History of Art and Visual Culture department for over 25 years. During that time, she has garnered awards for both teaching and mentoring, as EVC Kletzer already mentioned, and she is affiliated faculty in 5 other departments and programs: Critical Race and Ethnic Studies, Digital Arts and New Media, Feminist Studies, History of Consciousness, Latin American and Latino Studies. This, to me, is a testament to the depth and breadth of her scholarly influence across 5 subfields outside of her own. She worked for over a decade to help develop the Institute of Arts and Sciences, which now finally has a beautiful new home on Delaware Street, including an exhibition that she co-curated. And prior to her appointment as a faculty member in History of Art and Visual Culture, as some of you I know, Professor González received her PhD from the History of Consciousness department here. So her connection to UC Santa Cruz is long and deep. So let me give you one last example of Professor González's dedication to our campus community. Some of you may know that a dinner is normally given to honor the presenter of the faculty research lecture. There hasn't been a dinner. Maybe you're wondering, why is there no dinner? Professor González requested instead that funds that would have been spent on the dinner be donated to the newly renamed Dolores Huerta Research Center for the Americas. That tells you everything you need to know about her commitment to social justice, her commitment to building community at UC Santa Cruz, and her commitment to supporting the work of other scholars, of students, and of community members. It's now my great pleasure to welcome Professor Jennifer González to present the 55th UC Santa Cruz Faculty Research Lecture.
Wow, that was beautiful. I would really like to thank the Academic Senate for the invitation to speak with you this evening, Lori Kletzer and Shelley Stamp for their generous and kind introductions, and Dean Celine, Morgan Gardia for her tireless work on the publicity for the event and other organizational details, and John Radke, Juan Perez, Diana Hogue, David Morrison, and the Arts Division, and all the other university staff without whom this kind of gathering would not be possible. I also want to warmly thank Kirsten Silva Cruz, Professor of Literature, who will be agreeing to join me on stage at the end of my presentation for our very short discussion Q&A. And my deep, deep thanks to friends, family, students, and colleagues for coming out tonight. Although I write about art, I am an unusual art historian. Trained in philosophy, feminist theory, and cultural studies, I don't focus on defining the contours of art movements or the biographies of artists. Not that most contemporary art history is limited to these classic and worthy endeavors. Instead, my practice is more semantic and closer to what we now call visual studies. I'm curious about how artworks produce visual meanings at certain moments in history, how they emerge in relation to outside events, how they offer us a way to change our perspective or challenge our way of thinking. In short, I'm interested in how artworks perform a critical philosophy, a paradigm of knowing that is based on both inquiry and activism. I look for shared conceptual discourses, aesthetic intersections, comparative insights, and political affinities. For the last few years, I have been researching the question of speech and silence in contemporary art. I began with an interest in democracy, motivated by basic questions such as who speaks, who is heard, who is silent. Currently, I'm looking at artworks that focus on language and post-migration. By post-migration, I mean that liminal but also semi-permanent condition of those who have left their homes, frequently forfeiting their language and their civil rights, and are now experiencing, for better or often for worse, the challenges of a new life in a new location. More than 280,000 people, approximately 4% of the Earth's human population, live outside their country of origin. And that number is growing steadily. Because democracy conceptually depends upon a citizen subject who can speak, or at a minimum, vote, it is important to consider that the most universally disenfranchised population, with the possible exception of those who are imprisoned, are people living in a post-migratory condition. Other scholars have explored the intersection of visual art and migration. These studies include, for example, The Migrant Image by our colleague T.J. Demos, a really great book, The Migrant Time, edited by Saloni Mather, as well as Veronica Tello's Counter-Memorial Aesthetics on Refugee Histories, Rebecca Schreiber's The Undocumented Everyday, the edited volume Moving Images, Mediating Migration as Crisis, edited by one of our former students in History of Consciousness, Krista Lines, and most recently, The Undocumented Everyday, most recently, The Unsettled Borders, I skipped my line, The Militarized Science of Surveillance on Sacred Indigenous Land by our wonderful colleague Felicity Amaya Schaefer, which I encourage you to learn more about tomorrow at 4 o'clock, where she will give a book talk in Humanities 210. So I offer this slide mostly for interested students, but also to acknowledge that my talk is only a small contribution to a rich body of scholarly work on migration in the field. My particular focus is on language, and specifically artworks that explore the tensions of its opacity, the forms and consequences of its domination, and its potential to be reimagined. Tonight, I will discuss 4 artworks. The first, by Teresa Hak-Young Cha, is a live performance produced in the midst of the conceptual art and anti-war movements of the 1970s. The next 2 works, by Isaac Julian and Bushra Khalili, appear in the late 2000s, expanding critiques of global capitalism. The final project, which I touch on briefly at the end, by artists Castles and Rafa Esparza, radically expand the scale and scope of public art. The first 2 are memorials. The last 2 are imaginary counter-geographies. If geography is a mapping impulse that results in fixed boundaries and borders, a counter-geography intervenes in the conceptual logic of those maps and boundaries. Each artwork explores speech in relation to silence, word as image, and the bodily limits of language. While democracy per se is not their primary focus, democratic discourse is the potentiality, the agonistic horizon to which their work is addressed, interrogating the locus of speech and the challenge of being heard. I ask, what can this artwork teach us about the post-migratory condition? How are writing, speech, gesture, and geography reimagined in the process? Although they deploy different media, all of these works are time-based and ephemeral, emphasizing transformation, duration, repetition, movement, and disappearance. Post-migration stories are sometimes hard to tell, and this is also the subject of the work, the difficulty of voicing, the difficulty of telling. Despite this, they offer some room for hope. Let's begin with Voix aveugle, Blind Voice by Teresa Hak-Young Cha. Teresa Hak-Young Cha was a video and performance artist, poet and writer, feminist and historian. Fluent in Korean, English, and French, Cha was born during the Korean War in 1951 and lived in its aftermath before moving with her family to the United States in 1961, where she would earn 2 graduate degrees in literature and fine art from UC Berkeley in 1977 and 1978. She's best known for her experimental novel Dictée, published in 1982, shortly before her untimely death. In experimental prose and poetry, Dictée explores the force and imposition of war and imperializing language, especially on the lives of women. Pages of the book operate through juxtaposition and montage, with words, images, photographs, and diagrams operating intertextually. You can see here on the left side of the 2-page spread, she's working through the difficulty of speaking, broken language, pidgin, swallows, inhales, all of these truncated sentences. And on the left side of the 2-page spread, you see a medical diagram showing the larynx, the vocal cords. She's here inviting us to think about the physicality of speech. Scholar Lisa Lowe and others have observed that through playful and experimental grammars, Dictée intentionally misuses language, pressing it against its own limits of possibility. I start by mentioning Dictée because it offers a kind of retrospective key to reading the artist's earlier performance works. Cha comments, quote, "The main body of my work is with language, looking for the roots of language before it is born on the tip of the tongue," unquote. How might this idea of language before its birth on the tongue help us to read Voix aveugle, Blind Voice, the artist's performance that survives today in the form of documentary photographs at the Berkeley Art Museum and Film Archive? The first clue can be found in this modest, wrinkled cloth that served as the announcement for Cha's live performance, which took place on the streets of San Francisco one evening in late October. The announcement is very spare, but already suggests a kind of linguistic complexity, a translation or duality of language. The year is 1975, and it has been 6 months since the end of the Vietnam War, with the US withdrawal from Saigon in April. On the sidewalk in front of a stone building, Cha is dressed simply in white and begins the performance by wrapping a band of white fabric around her head. Both her clothing and forehead band likely reference the classic white seen at traditional Korean and Vietnamese funerals. Rather than wrapping a single white band around her forehead, however, Cha intentionally misuses or misplaces the fabric over her eyes and mouth. A memorial garment becomes a blindfold or a gag. Positioned as both mourner and victim, Cha hides her individual face, creating a powerfully anonymous figure that can stand in for a collective. With the word voix, voice, over her eyes, and aveugle, blind, over her mouth, she prompts us to imagine vocalizing with our eyes and what it might mean to impede a verbal gaze. Blind voice could also have the connotations of voice blindness, searching for words, struggling with linguistic enunciation as one might grope in the dark. After placing the bands, Cha begins to unroll a white cloth banner. The scroll might be interpreted as referencing a long tradition of painting and calligraphy, but it also functions as a political banner, and finally, as we shall see, a ceremonial mat. After walking carefully and slowly backwards with the scroll unwinding in front of her, the artist reveals words one by one that seem to precisely contradict their ability to make meaning. Words fail me, sans mot, without word, sans voix, without voice, aveugle geste, blind gesture. While some scholars have described the performance as a form of writing, it might be more accurate to see the performance as a kind of silent speech. The dance of the body, walking slowly backwards, creates a durational pull, a physical enactment that follows the rhythm of oral enunciation. If it was meant to be read, Cha could have simply hung the banner on a wall. Instead, each word is given a unique moment of appearance, and meaning emerges through a temporal unfolding. Once unfurled, the text becomes a ground to stand on. Cha walks around it with slow ritual movements, squatting near its edges, and eventually reaching out on hands and knees to feel the words with the gentle tactility of one who reads Braille. We can see the delicate scalloped shapes where the artist's hand has lingered in repetitive circular motions. Mark-making here is not only the painted stencil, but the ephemeral and temporary gesture of the artist's hand. Yet the stencil is also carefully selected. I researched a variety of commercial stencils available in the 1970s. Here are two examples. But Cha's deployment of the US Army typeface serves as an important graphical indictment. Its military connotations would have been familiar to her North American audience in 1975 from visual references in television, newspapers, and photographs. Returning to the performance announcement, we see in English words blind and voice, which, reversed as in a mirror, serve as a pseudo-shadow of the French words. When spoken, the phrase voix aveugle can also playfully suggest blind seeing or blind way, because voix voice and voix sight and voix way all sound the same in French. Cha's performance critiques US militarism as a blind gesture and war itself as a path of blindness that prematurely silences those in its wake. But as an enactment of unspoken speech, voix aveugle also invites us to witness the multilingual alienation of someone forced into systems of unfamiliar grammar, the stuttering and stopping of speech, the groping for meaning, searching for words to express the inexpressible, the moment when words fail. Hers is a self-imposed silence that nevertheless speaks, sharing characteristics with contemporary protests, meaning today, contemporary protests today, of refugees whose forms of self-silencing in public space enact what scholar Banu Bargu calls the silent exception, a politics of speech without speech. Cha's performance silently murmurs to us about the personal and collective consequences of war, militarism, and post-migration. In her practice of mourning, the artist returns us to the surface of the earth. We follow her searching fingers as they map out the language of the killer. But through Cha, these words are reimagined and transformed into the language of the survivor. This is meant to be blank. Similar memorial gestures can be found in the work of Isaac Julian, whose large-scale installation, 10,000 Waves, explores a more recent post-migration story. Before turning to his work, I simply want to mention that in 2022, the UN reported the recorded deaths of migrants since 2014 has reached 50,000 on routes to and within just Europe. So it's hardly surprising to learn that a decade earlier, Western Europe saw a dramatic rise in tragic events involving migrant populations. A particularly moving case in 2004 was the loss of 23 Chinese migrant workers in England who were drowned in Morecambe Bay by the swiftly rising tide. They were on the beach picking cockles and were likely unable to read the warning signs posted in English and were taken by surprise. And I purposely left this slide blank because I don't want to show images of news headlines about the tragedy. In response, British artist Sir Isaac Julian, one of our own distinguished faculty members, invited collaborators from China to create a sweeping memorial epic about the sea, global capital, and its deadly consequences in the work 10,000 Waves. It was very important to the artist that his Chinese collaborators, with whom he had long dialogues, take an active role in setting the tone, the text, and the image repertoire of the final work. Bringing together actors Maggie Cheung and Zhao Tao, renowned poet Wang Ping, master calligrapher Gong Faiyan, among others, Julian structured his 9-screen installation project around a 16th century fable from Fujian province, where the Morecambe Bay cockle pickers originated. The fable tells the story of fishermen lost at sea, rescued by the goddess Mazu, who leads them to safety. Still popular in Taiwan and China, Mazu, the eternal mother, known in her youth as the Silent Maiden, keeps watch over rivers, seas, and oceans. The goddess is played by Maggie Cheung, pictured here. In the final installation, purposefully stylized scenes from the fable are intercut with equally stylized scenes of the Morecambe Bay tragedy and Shanghai cinema of the 1930s, when the British controlled the international settlement there, creating an iterative layering of contemporary images with the historical past. Here you are seeing the installation at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, but there are more immersive versions that are designed to surround visitors. The sumptuous visual quality and high production value draws in the educated elite that frequent art gallery spaces, and the artist is quite aware of the audience that he is targeting. The screens in the gallery, as you just saw, are designed to envelop the visitor in a mobile world. I will be showing just 4 clips of this hour-long work that normally loops continuously in the gallery. Please imagine that you are surrounded by the image you will now see.
Hello, yeah, me pull over 1 minute.
Hello?
Like, I have got a load of Chinese boys in Morecambe Bay, and they're stuck, because the cockle pickers, and they need to pay or something, you're going to have to get them out of there.
What, they just told you, have they?
Like, my boyfriend's brother, he's on the beach now, we're on the way to pick them up now.
Right.
And they need to get out. And they're all Chinese, so you're going to have a problem with the English, but can you please just get something out there now?
And how many are out there, do you know?
How many men? There's a lot. 25 people.
Right, they've been on the cockle bed, have they, in Morecambe there?
Yeah, cockle bed, Morecambe Bay, can you please just...
Are they okay? Are they on the bank or have they got water now?
Are they okay? Have they got bikes? Got bikes? Have they got bikes?
Get them all out.
Just people on their bikes? Just people? Hello?
Yeah?
Just people?
It can be a little hard to notice, but the brush is as tall as the man who is wielding it in this image. Looks like it got stopped. Sorry, I don't know why it stopped. Let's start again. I think I accidentally touched the screen. There we go. 10,000 waves drops us directly into the rising water. Hands flail in the murky depths. A woman calls emergency dispatchers. One begins to feel the power of the dark sea that renders all breathless, voiceless. Although highly choreographed and artificial, there are no images of actual victims in this work. The scene feels raw and factual, with the handheld blurriness of camera shots and urgency of the landscape and the soundscape. As viewers, we are tossed about with the water rising noisily above our heads, and then silence, a sudden shift to the empty space of another world, the blank field of the word, of language, of a languid and delicate calligraphic performance. The body of the writer is dwarfed by the word that he so gracefully paints moving across the screen. Wave. We glide in the liquid world of ink like the liquid world of water, one the source of life, the other the source of writing. According to the BBC, emergency services were alerted by a mobile phone call made by one of the workers who spoke little English and was only able to say, "sinking water," before the call was cut off. But what of Mazu, the sea goddess? This next sequence takes us back to the fabled 16th century landscape where Mazu wields power. The scene opens on a verdant landscape. Over the river, men walk in a line across an old stone bridge. Mazu observes their progress watchfully and serves as a sentinel for the valley, her own head and falling hair echoing the rounded shapes of mountains on the horizon. Indeed, there seem to be many embedded references to traditions in Chinese landscape painting here. Julian's misty vistas share compositional elements with classic inkwash landscapes such as Summer Mountains by the Northern Song painter Ku Ding. Julian's image of a raft quietly floating on still water suggests the kind of work done by Shen Zhu, a Ming Dynasty Wu school painter. Both allusions are likely to be familiar to his Chinese audience. In addition to historical references, the bamboo forest and floating goddess also allude to the work of director Ang Lee and the well-known film Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. Yet, by placing a solitary female figure gazing out across the landscape, Julian reconfigures the gender dynamic of both Wu and Northern Song style paintings that often show a solitary male figure alone in nature as a seeker of truth. But the goddess Mazu is called from this peaceful retreat of idealized nature into the urban present. and displacement ultimately thwart the goddess, who, hovering above Shanghai, seems dwarfed by the skyscrapers that now rise up to meet her, and the woman inside the room, lifting the phone receiver, pacing the floor, and looking out the window, repeated across multiple screens, mirrors hundreds and thousands of such rooms, isolated chambers, testifying to a loneliness and cell-like uniformity in architectures of wealth. As viewers of 10,000 Waves, we are caught up in a condition of syncopated visuality. The artist has stated, quote, "What I call parallel montage relates to the choreography of the gaze. It's also about the way in which the screens are articulated architecturally and how people relate to them in space. Rejecting traditional narrative realism, as Mark Nash has observed, the scenes expose the way images are always constructed. The artist purposefully includes demystifying and Brechtian moments of the production process. The harness and strings, green screen, and wind fans that create the cinematic illusion of Mazu's flight emphasize that this is an artificially constructed world made by those who labor off-screen. Near the end of the work, writing re-enters the frame. This last video clip has some longer durational moments of stillness, so I invite you to relax into the quiet pauses. Here we have the tactile pleasure of watching master calligrapher Gang Fayen write out the phrase 10,000 waves on glass. Seen as through water, an invisible surface, the characters he draws are backwards to us because we are inside them, in the impossible two-dimensional flatness of the other side of language looking out. As the ink slowly drips from the thousands upon thousands of waves multiplied across screens, the spell is broken by young men who step forward to erase the words in efficient circular gestures. Language, life, perhaps even history is wiped away. Echoing the circular scallops of Cha's fingers, here a painterly abstraction emerges. Modernity and a younger generation moves on. The artwork concludes with the cleanup crew, again bringing typically off-screen labor back to the center of the post-migration experience. Julian plays with a hybrid realism that imagined forms of contact between past and present. In a poem titled Small Boats, written for 10,000 Waves, Wang Ping gives voice to those who have drowned, writing, 10,000 waves push me to shore. My son skips rocks on the rolling sea. Will he hit me, bodiless soul? Foam among endless waves. Will he raise a lantern on my path, a soul, bodiless, floating on the swollen North Wales Sea? Speaking under the water, inside the sea, that can still be touched by a rock, yet is nothing but foam. The parent yearns for their child from a bodiless, silent place. I'm a poet, Isaac Julian has said. I'm interested in poetry. If we think of 10,000 Waves as metered and measured stanzas, elements of rhythmic composition, then we begin to see how the work yields echoes and repetitions, as well as what Saadia Hartman calls critical fabulations. archivally informed fictions about those who cannot tell their own stories. And if we think with and beyond Hartman's now frequently referenced concept, we recognize all fiction as embedded with varying degrees of realism. Interestingly, Julian's work has been criticized for being too beautiful, a criticism that ignores, in my opinion, the long history of lyricism in art and music that is intended to move us. Though he references fine art, painting, and film history, Julian also intervenes in a newer media-saturated environment where all kinds of violence appears aestheticized and normalized. 10,000 Waves shows us how the tragedy of Morecambe Bay is part of long-standing, elliptical, and entangled economic relations between the UK and China. As a memorial project, 10,000 Waves foregrounds these tragic and mutually constituted labor relations, but its peaceful and poetic lyricism also honors those lives lost. There are clear parallels, but also key differences between the sumptuous, nearly operatic work of Isaac Julian and the sparer cinema verite style of French-Moroccan artist Bouchra Khalili's mapping journey project. Khalili was born in Casablanca, Morocco in 1975 and lives in France and Germany. Over the course of 3 years between 2008 and 2011, the artist conducted a series of interviews with 8 people in different cities around France and the Mediterranean, all migrants or exiles. The result is an 8-screen installation. You see a partial view here at the New Museum in New York, in which the subjects tell their stories with maps and the simple device of a pen on paper. Like Julian, Khalili approaches her installation project with a similar interest in combining individual screens to form a larger work. The Mapping Journey project offers a gestalt or all-over experience that emphasizes visual parallels among the screens. Khalili has commented that each screen offers fragments of geography based on individual experiences of moving across space and time, and may evoke for us our own personal fragments of geography that we live out. She gathers into compressed physical space a set of rhythmic actions, the hands of her interviewees moving like choreographed bodies in space. Viewers should navigate between the screens, the artist suggests, creating their own journey within the installation. Mapping and counter-mapping highlight the paradox embedded in the lines, created to demarcate boundaries and borders, and the ways in which these lines have real bodily consequences. The Mapping Journey project started showing in Europe and in the US around 2013, 2014. Migrant crossings in Europe peaked in 2015, with over 1 million making the crossing, 80% of whom were refugees from wars in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Several thousand migrants die each year or go missing across the Mediterranean. Despite the fact that fewer are now crossing, more are dying due to new European laws that effectively prohibit their rescue. It is estimated that even greater numbers perish along land routes through the Sahara Desert and remote border areas. At the core of the artwork is the question of what one's experience of geography might be when one does not have the privilege to travel safely or freely. Khalili distinguishes between her work and that of an ethnographer who goes out looking for subjects to interview. The artist records the stories of people she has encountered in her own personal everyday life, with whom she has developed a relationship of trust, mutual curiosity, and openness. Conversations with participants take place over several days or several weeks before filming begins. 2 of the videos are English speakers, 2 Italian, and 4 are in Arabic languages, sometimes merged with French. The fact that the artist is multilingual was instrumental to the project. Khalili commented that it was, quote, a lot about patience and just listening. Against the official maps of the territories that lie silent, the travelers speak and draw a new trajectory and permanent markers. A counter-geography is created that puts an indelible mark on the surface of the paper, pressing back against the current limits of movement maintained by nation-states. The hand moves carefully across the map, stopping the pen and resting on cities, ports, detention centers, refugee camps. Each portrait is one long, uninterrupted shot. But sometimes it's clear that pauses in the narrative are caused by the emotion created by memories. The installation as a whole offers the viewers the possibility to witness emerging parallels among the stories. The moving hands, disembodied, are still very alive, though the room is silent. Post-migratory narration, like post-traumatic storytelling, can sustain repetition. Indeed, many migrants must repeat their stories multiple times to authorities without changes in order to be considered for refugee status. The looping videos enact this repetition, the telling and retelling of narrative, implying the hundreds and thousands of narratives we are not hearing, the trajectories we are not seeing. In order to protect the identities of her participants, Khalili gives each anonymous narrative a number. And I'm going to show you 2 clips of numbers 2 and 4. Each one is about 1.5 minutes.
جيت من تونس العاصمة، قطعت ليبيا الخميس. من الخميس ركبنا في بتيت باطو، رحنا بيه، قطعنا بيه البحر لامبادوزا. قعدنا في لامبادوزا 2 jours dans l'hôtel. الشرطة الإيطالية تحررت معانا، بعديك داونا الباري. من باري قعدنا في المخيمات تاع لاكرواروج. من بعد سيبونا، عطاونا ليكسبيرسيون بور كيتي لي تروتوار ايطاليان. دونك رحت نابولي. تما في نابولي استقريت. تما كنت نخدم بزنس في السوق تاع الملابس. من نابولي رحت روما، استقريت في روما وقت من الزمن. بعديك من روما جيت لمارسيليا هنايا. جيت لمارسيليا، عندي شهر في مارسيليا. نتمنى ان شاء الله نخدم ورقية ونعيش comme tout le monde là en Europe pour travailler, c'est tout. C'est pas pour faire quelque chose pas bien. ونتمنى ان شاء الله نشوف يما ولا مكان.
Poi mi sono fermato qualche giorno e poi l'ho preso pullman per andare di Sarghese, arrivato con l'aereo. Poi dopo Hargeisa andò col pullman Etiopia di Sababa. Poi dopo Hargeisa mi sono fermato altri 3 giorni. Mi sono preso un altro pullman per arrivare in Sudan. Sono arrivato qui Qatarif. Vicino a Qatarif mi sono fermato 6 giorni, sulla pullman sono arrivato. Poi mi sono preso un altro pullman a Qatarif, arrivai a Khartoum. Dopo Khartoum mi sono preso un altro pullman per andare in Libia. Qui non era proprio un pullman, una macchinina più piccola di pullman che prendevo qui per arrivare in Libia, Kufra. Sono stati 5 giorni qui. Però qui è proprio tutta la sabbia, si chiama Sahara, non c'è l'albero, non c'è proprio, non è un posto di può vivere proprio. Quando fa caldissimo. Mi sono stati comunque 5 giorni qui per arrivare a Kufra. cuffia mi sono preso un'altra piccola macchinina per andare Libia. Io pensavo a Libia, però mi hanno portato pensavo a Tripoli, però mi hanno portato a Bangassi, qui, per la città si chiama.
Voice in the work is critical. Each video has headphones, and what we hear, even if we do not understand the language, is the intimacy of individuals speaking in the first person. Sometimes the female speakers recount the struggles they face with the men they encounter, even within their own extended families. Such intimate reflections are, as the artist has commented, the opposite of a documentary voiceover. Instead, we're brought inside the speaker's story, opening up the possibility of identification. We see a hand that is filmed as if viewed from the first person, as if we are looking down at the map ourselves, creating a kind of disembodied connection to the careful mark-making as the narrative unfolds in our ears. The generic and unchanging surface of the map produces a tension. The visitor must imagine rather than see the places described by the traveler. They must imagine the fear, the hunger, the relief or loss as they follow each story. Toby Haslett writes that Khalili's works remind him of Etienne Balibar's distinction between those who circulate capital and those who are circulated by it. Quote, her works are attached to political suffering, he writes, but retreat from sentimentalism, unquote. As with Cha and Julian's works, the Mapping Journey Project emphasizes how language can be a medium of betrayal or exposure, but also power. Here, Khalili invites us to think about civil poetry, one in which the subject takes possession of their own speech, especially when they recognize their voice is not singular but collective. Khalili's use of the term civil poetry is similar to the term civic poetry, as my colleague Kirsten Cruz pointed out, often used to describe politically engaged writing, such as the work of Claudia Rankine. Whether civil or civic, Khalili also enables what Michel Foucault has called fearless speech. Fearless speech is a form of talking back, speaking truth to power, when the one who is speaking puts their own life at risk. We see the struggle to evade official capture, the struggle to find food, and to continue onward despite setbacks. The counter maps created by the speakers, as I've already mentioned, produce counter geographies of the present, their mark-making a form of drawing. Following Khalili's civil poetry, or here we might even think of Ariela Azule's civil photography, such mark-making might be called civil drawing. We might see Teresa Cha's circular motions on the cloth banner, the calligraphic painting, but the circular streaks also created by its erasure in 10,000 waves as forms of civil drawing or civil gesture. Following the Mapping Journey project, Khalili made a series of prints called the Constellation Series. As you can see better in this close-up, the screen prints in varying hues of blue capture only the shape of the drawings made by the speakers, and the star points are the cities along the looping and sometimes unsuccessful voyages. Their stories, their voices, and their civil poetry will always have an accompanying geography and shift the meaning, shift the relation of the cities it maps. If we watch their daunting trajectories across sea and land from an aerial perspective in the videos, we are invited to see these simple yet striking prints as a witness to the imaginary sky space of a reconfigured Earth. Which brings me in closing to the last work I want to share with you, X-Map in Plain Sight, led by the artists Castles and Rafa Esparza. X-Map in Plain Sight is a massive collaborative effort of more than 80 artists and organizers that speak to the immigration crisis in the US, including child separation, detention centers, and human rights abuses. The artists state that they see the work as a form of vocal amplification. In the year 2020, they commissioned the largest fleet of skywriting planes in the country, called Skytypers, to fly over 80 cities in the US on July 4th. The planes flew over cities from Los Angeles to New York, and focused on crowded urban environments to address large audiences, border regions, and, as this detail shows, in places like Texas and Louisiana, where many detainees are being held for extended periods. The urban location of some correctional facilities can come as a surprise to residents in cities. Here we see the phrase, "Stop Crimigation Now," protesting the criminalization of immigration. In Los Angeles, borders become militarized zones where desire for a better life meets the steel edge of death or detention. Here the artist Marcos Ramirez writes, "I am a cloud of hope," over the US-Mexican beach border. The remote location of other detention centers exacerbates the difficulties involved in accessing and regulating them, ensuring their populations remain invisible. In Louisiana, few knew that the River Correctional Center was being used to hold immigrants until news organizations reported that asylum seekers had staged a hunger strike. One key problem is language, especially when only Spanish interpreters have been provided. Many applicants come from Central American countries. In Guatemala alone, there are over 20 indigenous languages spoken. In Honduras, at least 8. Mexico currently recognizes 68 national languages, 63 of which are indigenous. Imprisonment in detention centers in the US for thousands of people can mean a form of permanent abandonment in linguistic limbo, without parole. In stasis, their lives temporarily halted in the peculiar emptiness of waiting. They experience what scholar Kat Ramirez calls undocu-time. But skywriting can be seen for many miles, alerting a broad and possibly unsuspecting public to the location and activity of these prisons. Here we see part of the phrase, "no wall, no muro," by artist Carolina Caicedo, who, incidentally, will be showing her work at the Institute of the Arts and Sciences, opening this Friday. I hope you go and see it. In my conversation with the artists, Castles and Esparza, they emphasize the importance of exposing US sky space to a variety of languages for the first time, including indigenous languages, as well as non-Roman alphabet Arabic languages and Haitian Creole, among others. For example, the Haitian Bridge Alliance chose the phrase, please forgive my pronunciation, l'espoir ak liberté, hope and freedom. While Amy Juan and Michael Ennis with Kanupa Hanska did from the, representing the Tohono O'odham Nation, they wanted to present "All people are sacred," which is what you're seeing now in the sky, but it was too long. So they had to settle for "Take care," which you see written up there. Signaling the wide variety of languages and peoples who belong in the US, the project explicitly rejects the dominance of English. As you can see, these last 2 slides are graphical recreations because the wind would often carry away the words at the beginning of the phrase before the plane had reached the end. My last image is of Rafa Esparza's echo of the 1970s Chicanx statement, "We didn't cross the border crossed us." Here in the present tense, la frontera nos cruzó, the frontier, the border crosses us. Through a kind of civil drawing, the sky speaks in this work as a temporary voice. Water vapor acts as the breath of words and phrases that float and aspirate across landscapes, prison walls, borders, and barriers. Then the words blur and dissipate. Writing is reimagined, not only as voice, but as a counter-geographical civil gesture that calls out to us waiting for a response. And we can respond because #XMAP, in plain sight, connects viewers to an interactive website that locates immigrant detention centers in their vicinity, introduces them to organizational partners, and shows them how to support local campaigns for human rights. So I encourage you to look up XMAP, #XMAP. I titled the talk "Silent Speech, Migratory Gesture" to indicate how migration can produce forms of silence, but also how silence can constitute a kind of political speech, and to signal the ways that gestures figure in this work, especially mark-making gestures that leave temporary but tactile traces. Each of the artworks I introduced tonight investigates the post-migratory condition in a different way, asking us to see language as a device that sutures or blinds the embodied human subject to their conditions of existence. Words like nation, race, and citizen are human abstractions that can disrupt, sever, and ultimately wound the biological continuum that is our real cellular existence on Earth. Militarism, finance capitalism, and climate disaster lead people to be sorted by, constrained by, and defined by these abstractions. While acknowledging struggle and loss, the artworks I showed tonight offer new epistemologies of strength, beauty, and the political will to bring about change. Thank you. So now we'll have the house lights up, and excellent. So thank you so much, Kirsten, for coming up. I'm just going to have a sip of water. So many thanks again to Kirsten, Professor in the Literature Department, for being willing to ask some questions.
Jennifer, thank you so much for that luminous talk. And there's so many points of overlap between our worlds, and of course I want to ask you about poetry. Some of the works that you showed us incorporated written poems, textual poems, the usual thing we think about when we hear the word poem. But you also had a wonderful interpretation of 10,000 Waves. The point that you made about seeing it as a large-scale rhythmic composition that made use of the same bag of tricks a written poem might use, like repetitions of the same word or sound and groupings of lines into stanzas. And so I'm thinking of all the poets, including Cha, who have played with the page as if it's a visual canvas, or who have incorporated sound and embodied gesture in performance poems, in which there's also a unique iteration every time and this kind of evanescence that you describe. So where do we draw the line between a visual poem and a poetic image? Should we just call it all art?
Actually, I think that's a great question. I would like to say that there's probably something to be gained for keeping the term poetry alive. I think if we just call it all art, well, we can recognize that there are certainly artistic qualities to these works, that the idea that we construct something like a poem has a long history in human cultures, and that long history actually attaches to the way we understand poetry as working against the way we speak in our everyday language. So what makes poetry poetry, going back to Roman Jakobson, or pick who you want, Victor Shklovsky, the idea of defamiliarization, what makes poetry poetry is that it's not everyday language, that it shifts and pushes words to do things that we're not used to having them do. And I think that's one of the things that is valuable about the concept of poetry in language. And that if artists want to be able to think about that and borrow that activity of shifting an image or pushing a form beyond the way it's usually used or presented, that poetry gives them a great model for how to think about that. And then more explicitly about Julian's work, there are many moments, and you may have noticed these in the clips that I showed, where there are reversals. So just as there was that reversal in the Cha sort of announcement to her performance, throughout the work by Julian, you'll see the men walking across the bridge, but reflected in the water upside down. You'll see other moments of reversal that happen throughout the entire work. And those reversals in the physical space of the gallery when you're experiencing it often happen in front and behind you, so that you kind of have to turn around and move your own body in relationship to the bodies that are moving. And so that kind of movement, I think, is interesting. I've called it a kind of poetics of attention. That is, the syncopation of the images, their repetition, their rhythm, actually invites you, the viewer, to have to move your body and your gaze in that rhythmic syncopation. And in so doing, you're kind of writing the poem along with the work as it goes through. I hope that's it.
That's wonderful, like a call and response poem or a collective recitation.
Yeah, exactly.
By the way, I'm scanning the audience here, so please do raise your hand if you have another question to ask.
Yes, please raise your hand for questions. They'll bring a mic around, so they'll just wait till the mic comes to you first.
Thank you. Can you hear me? All right, great. So thank you for this beautiful presentation. And I have a question about labor. I was really just struck by the references to it, the oblique references, and the overt ones, the significance of the cleanup crew in 10,000 Waves. And then the first speaker in Khalili's The Mapping Journey project states that he just wants to work. He doesn't want to do bad things. And then there was a quote that you provided about, I'm going to butcher it, but how, I guess, capital moves people. And so much of migration is because of labor, for labor, because of a lack of sufficient labor. And I'm just wondering where and how labor fits into these works. I'd love to hear more about that.
I just like what you said. So I don't think there's any way to talk about contemporary migration without talking about global capital and labor. It's really, we're living in a condition where in this incredibly wealthy, privileged, dripping with resources, location, really in a contrast to the lives of people who are really suffering in many parts of the planet. And it's interesting to think about how labor in many cultures is made to be invisible. In other words, we're supposed to keep labor behind the scenes. We're supposed to not see the cleanup crew. We're not supposed to notice the janitors that come to our offices to clean out our waste paper baskets here at the university. There's a kind of aesthetics of invisibility of labor that I would say is about a kind of a human habit, which is a human embarrassment about labor disparity and income disparity. And if you don't have to see the labor, you don't have to think about it. And what I like about the work of Julian and others that carry on this question is that they're trying to find ways to show the labor, the off-screen labor, the tragic deaths of laborers who are not given the resources they need to actually successfully labor even, and who risk their lives on a daily basis because they don't know the language, because they can't find their way maybe to and fro on the subway. There's the demands placed on migrant labor are extremely high, as we well know, as Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez taught us many years ago. So I just appreciate your comment and say, yes, indeed, that's a critical issue that I'm thinking about.
Hello, Jennifer. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. Just a comment, a contribution to the theme of poetics and the instrument of poetry as a form of social justice. Your talk reminds me a bit of, I'm sure my colleague in the English department, literature might know better than I do about this subject matter. It reminds me of the Restoration play in 18th century England, when a play like Wycherley and Congreve, in which at the end, if a character died unjustly, or being treated unjustly on stage, the audience can raise their hand and say and ask what meant of poetic justice. So I thought that would, kind of align with what further the theme of, the role and the theme of poetry and language and play in this context. So it's just a comment. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. In the middle.
Do we have any questions in the Zoom chat?
Hi, Jennifer. Thank you so much for this incandescent talk. I was really struck about the different relationship of these images to duration, to time and duration. Some of them stretch out the instant that they're recording. Some of them are really sharp and passing and kind of contemporaneous with an action. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about these experiments with time and how they seem to you to be wrapped up in the burden of the work of historicization, which is whether it's of the actual immediate present or whether with Hak Young Cha, with the work of the nearly just past but still lingering history of Vietnam. But I wonder if you could sort of say a little something about what it means for the visual to engage the temporal.
Yeah, that's a lovely question. Thank you. I think that, as I mentioned, the first two works are really memorials. And I think one of the interesting things about a memorial is that it is a re-enlivening through memory of something that is absent. And in that re-enlivening in some way, it makes it present. And thinking about the challenge of crossing that temporal zone, I'm intrigued by the fact that the artists find language to be the bridge. In an interesting way, language is the bridge, but gesture is the feeling, which sometimes is ironic because sometimes we think of it in the reverse. But in this case, language is a temporal bridge, so references can be made, for example, in Cha's work, more in dictée than in the piece that I showed here, to moments of imperial language imposition that then kind of re-emerge in her use of both English and French as a kind of residue of a past having been imperialized and a present groping into the new kind of imperialism, as it were, in the US. Death is a kind of, is a condition under which, the death of many, that is the condition under which her displacement took place. And so death is the condition, but the language is the thing that actually images the time shift. I think it's different in something like Julian, where it's much more like an opera or a historical novel or something. In other words, it's really playing with layering, as I suggested, kind of iterative layering of different historical moments and very explicit allusions, visual allusions, sonic allusions, to invite his audience to try to make these different kinds of connections between the past and the present. And if we follow all the clues, come away with this not a clear picture, which is, I think, his point. We come away with a very jumbled, layered, compressed set of images that invite us to then consider, what is the relationship between Britain and China, and how far back does it go, and what does this have to do with the 1930s and today? And that in itself is what the goal of the work is to sort of enliven that question making. So I would say that in that case, the shifts in temporality throw people off on purpose. They're there to throw people off of feeling like they know where they are and they know when they are.
And your examples were also challenging the notion that writing is the more permanent form of language, that astonishing image of the beautiful Chinese characters being so cruelly wiped out and erased with Windex was really effective in making the ephemerality of language And with the sky typing also.
Yeah, exactly, that kind of losing of the blurring away. Oh, there's another one there. Maybe. Question right
there. Hello, thank you for your beautiful talk. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the last two works that you gave an analysis on, especially since they're both talking about migration and stories that are very rooted with land and space, in particular geographies, and how the artists are, one, using language to communicate these stories, and I feel like there's a sense of bearing witness to that as the viewer, but at the same time, there's barriers that are created, right? You might not speak that language, might be able to read those things. And then the artist takes them into like a celestial, cosmological kind of realm that in turn begins to bear witness for these stories. So I'm wondering if you can speak about that shift that is created in those works.
Sure. Yeah, it's a great observation and the comment. So, I'm interested in the way Khalili does that move, making those prints, inviting us to rethink the earth through a new map-making process, right? And I'm interested in the way we don't necessarily have access in the rough Esparza and Castle's project, XMAP, to everything that is happening in the sky. We don't have access maybe to every language that's present, and we don't have access when the voices are speaking. And they're not only addressing English audiences either. So some of us do have access, right? I mean, I think the point is that some people have access to everything in the last two works that I showed, but it might not be the majority of us in this room. And part of it is to, again, coming back to a decentering move, is to really push people to think about, in a word, to provincialize them, to make them realize that they are not in a position of a kind of universal subject, and that if we see writing in the sky that we don't understand, we might want to ask, what does it mean and how do we find out? And it's again that pushing to curiosity that the work engages. But also, it invites us who do identify with what's happening in the sky, those people who do speak the language, do recognize the words, to feel a sense of belonging, to feel a sense of place, to feel a sense that their story or their language is valued and valuable and present, and should be valued and present. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but is that about right? Okay. I'm not sure if we should just do one more. I don't know how we're doing on time.
I think one more?
Okay, one more. Okay, back there. Yeah, Lori.
Thank you very much for your amazing talk and for bringing to us those particular works in this context, and which is where my question kind of comes from, because you are thinking them together in this sort of space of discussion and in relation to, creating a talk. And I wonder if you could speak to the spaces of display or the spaces of exhibition and reception for each of the works that you showed, the choices that were made by the artists to show where they showed and why. It's a big question, but I feel like it's related to the question that came before and to your work in the longer term, going all the way back to that first amazing, amazing and influential book. So thank you again.
Oh, thank you, Lori. No, it's an excellent question, and in fact, I had to take a whole section out of the talk because it got too long about why I'm looking at these different modalities at these different scales. And I actually wanted precisely to bring in something that was a very intimate scale, like Trisha's work, that, as far as we know, was only performed once. We don't know the size of the audience. It might have just been the photographer and the people who happened to be on the street at San Francisco late at night. And so then the question becomes, what constitutes a performance when it's, a performance with a very small audience? And clearly, she was using photography as documentation for the work. She wanted it to be photographed. And in another version of the talk, I talk about photographs in dictée that she's possibly that inspired photographs that show up in dictée later of prisoners that have dressed in white as well. So I'm interested in her work as a kind of photographic practice as much as a performance. So small scale, and then gallery audience, which is, again, a kind of educated elite in often metropolises, Los Angeles, New York, Paris, where these works have the infrastructure to show. It's expensive work, needs a lot of electricity, big screens, all kinds of money go into it. And I think there's a tendency to see that as a flaw in work, that somehow it's been kind of co-opted by the system. But actually, I just think every platform is the important platform, and every platform should be occupied, and therefore, in this sense, I really think that both Khalili and Julian, in their own ways, very aesthetically different, are still addressing that same sort of educated gallery-going audience, hoping that 1 or 2 or 10 or 20 of the people who visit their exhibitions will actually start to get involved politically in what's happening. And I can tell you that I saw Isaac Julian's Western Union Small Boats back in 2008, and it got me politically motivated to write about it. So there is an impact in a different way, I would say, of their work. And then, frankly, I think that, the wonderful artists, Castles and Rafa Esparza, who do really important work and who represent a queer community. And by the way, almost all of the 80 participants are trans and queer participants. And I just think it's important to note that, but I'll say it now. Their work is brilliant. They're really, really bringing the message to people all over the entire country. There's a kind of, it's a little bit quixotic in the sense that it goes really fast. Like, we don't know how many people really get to see, especially in the more rural areas. It's windy, it's cloudy. Some of them don't work as well as others. But many were seen in major metropolises. Millions and millions of people saw this project. Millions and millions of people saw this project. And I would say that that's very effective vocalizing and really inspiring as a way of thinking also about crossing borders and boundaries and how you can use the space available to you to reject the lines and demarcations and barbed wire fences that get in our way. So I really think it's a wonderful work in so many ways because it precisely moves beyond that intimate scale to like a mass scale. And because I think that that's the scale at which we're really going to have to make change.
It's the civil poetry that Khalili was talking about. Yeah. Well, with that, I think we should thank Professor Jennifer González again for
Thank you, everybody.